Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome everyone. Today we're going to be talking about Up in Smoke Part 6. Today we're going to be talking about the unsolved mystery of Susan Powell. Now by January of 2010, Joshua would actually take his two sons, Charles and Braden, and would move out of Utah and move in with his father Stephen over in Washington, which was about 900 miles away. And not only would Joshua and his two sons be living with Stephen, but at the same time during this time, Stephen would also have his son Michael and his daughter Alina living at the same house. It's also around this time when they were living with Stephen that Joshua would start not letting Susan's parents, Chuck and Judy Cox, having anything to do with their grandchildren. And with dealing with the recent news of their daughter being missing, with rightful reason, this would make Chuck and Judy Cox extremely devastated. It's also around this time, while all this was going on, friends and family in Utah would start talking to the police about not only Joshua, but also the marriage between Joshua and Susan. Joshua would tell his friends and family and pretty much anyone around that he started distancing himself from the Mormon faith because he would just feel alienated from the Mormon church, and would also make claims that the Mormon church was trying to persuade Susan to get a divorce from him. But this would, in turn to be false. It's also around this time the police would learn that Susan and Joshua's marriage was not as picture perfect as they would paint on a lot of their pictures, where friends and family would say that there was a lot of marital problems, and would even tell the police that on multiple occasions a lot of these disagreements that Susan and Joshua had would end in these screaming matches. The police would even find out and learn that there was at least one incident of Susan and Joshua's marriage that would include one case of domestic abuse. And then the police would uncover even more information and would find out that right before her disappearance, Susan was actually trying to save money to eventually leave her husband Joshua. Now, this doesn't hold any truth or claim that the Mormon faith was pressuring her to divorce her husband, as Susan had been doing everything in her power to try to fix her marriage, and had gone through multiple times telling friends, family, and people in her congregation that she wanted so desperately to fix her marriage, and she just wanted her best friend and her lover back. But with all the mounting problems that Susan and Joshua were having, she was pretty much done, and at this time was saving up money to move away from her husband. And she had planned that she was going to leave him in April, which would have fell right on their anniversary. But she would consider April D-Day, so to speak, and was kind of giving Joshua an opportunity to kind of change his ways and just start working on their marriage. But would say if he had not changed by April, that she was ultimately done and ending the marriage. Another big problem that Joshua and Susan would often argue and fight about was that they often struggled with financial issues, due in part because Joshua had a habit of spending his money very extravagantly. And it was so bad that by 2007, Joshua would declare himself bankrupt and had actually gotten himself in over $200,000 in debt. The police would also unearth more written documents written by Susan, and a lot of these written documents in her journals would talk about how Susan was in constant turmoil from her marriage with Joshua, and would make other claims in these journals that she was in constant fear, not only in her marriage, but for her life, and would make the statements in these journals that she was so afraid that if she tried to leave Joshua, that he would ultimately try to destroy her. not just try to destroy keeping her from having a life with her children, but even going as far to destroying her physically, which is another reason why she was so scared of leaving Joshua. The police would also learn that not only was Joshua very controlling, but also extremely possessive, and would even control all of the money that was spent, not only between himself and Susan's money as well, and would have full control of her bank accounts, which also made no sense as for the fact that Susan was the primary breadwinner in the family, whereas Joshua himself was just known for putting the family farther and farther into debt. But this would obviously give reason why Joshua had probably raised Susan's life insurance policy up to $1.5 million. It's around this time that the police learned about how much of a good mother that Susan actually was, and would learn that even though they struggled financially, Susan would do anything she could do to provide for her children. And during the times of when Joshua was spending money and putting the family in debt, and would not have a lot of money for a lot of spending, even groceries, Susan would not give up hope. And she would actually start making a little garden around their house, so that even if they didn't have money for groceries, she would even try to grow her own vegetables so that she could ultimately feed her family, which speaks volumes in just how devoted she was, not only as a mother, but a wife. So the police would quickly learn that there's no way that someone this devoted, not only to her children, but her spouse, would just up and leave in the middle of the night, completely abandoning all her clothes, cell phone, her children, and so on. Now, originally, when Susan had disappeared, Chuck and Judy Cox were extremely supportive of Joshua and had assumed that everyone just wanted to know where their daughter was. And it wasn't until certain things came to light that, with good reason, Chuck and Judy Cox would just start distancing themselves not only from Stephen and Joshua, but the entire family and the Powell family as well. And with good reason, be extremely upset when it came to learn about all of the possessive and controlling nature of Joshua, and just how much fear she was during her marriage. And the fact that Joshua was showing no interest in trying to find Susan would give them more reason to suspect that maybe Joshua was behind it. This ultimately would create a lot of problems between the Cox and the Powell family, to the point that they had to put a restraining order between the two families to where they could not be within 500 feet of each other. And this particular restraining order will have a big part to play later on in the story. Joshua during this entire time would maintain his innocence, and while living in Washington with his father, would start making claims in November of 2010 that his wife was completely unstable, and the reason she had disappeared is that she had ran away with another guy. Stephen would actually be very supportive of these claims, and Joshua would also make other claims as well, as the reason he moved out of Utah and with his father in Washington is that his face was in the media constantly, and he just wanted to get away from all the media attention. And big shock, Joshua would start playing the part and victimizing himself during this entire investigation. It's even around this time that Joshua would create a webpage for Susan as a way to keep updates on finding his lost wife. But a lot of these claims were just ways of Joshua could try to give out a lot of different ideas of making himself seem innocent. And he would ultimately start going around and telling people in interviews that everything that was going on in the investigation was a smear campaign against him, which is absolutely ridiculous.